On this edition of Leaders in Focus here at IMG Studios, Stockley Park, the outgoing Director of Sport at the BBC, Barbara Slater.
She'll be talking us through the unique challenges of running sport at the BBC since 2009.
Over the last decade, sports rights have doubled and the BBC's income has gone down 30%.
The nuts and bolts of negotiation.
I've just loved working with somebody who's just no nonsense and straight dealing.
And her defining moments from a storied career.
Because it was so clear what we had to do, everybody rallied behind, and I think it's probably the best team spirit that I've ever experienced.
This is Leaders in Focus. Barbara Slater, thank you for joining us on Leaders in Focus. You've just come to the end of your stint as Director of Sport at the BBC. I think it's the question that you're never supposed to ask, but how are you feeling?
I think it's going to be a big change of life, but I think it's the right thing. And, you know, I've absolutely loved my time at the BBC, loved the job, but there comes a point when it's time to hand the baton on. And I think now's the right time.
Let's go right back to the start, though. Tell us a little bit about how you and the BBC first came together.
So I was a gymnast, and I think that gave me a little opening and an opportunity. And I was asked by ITV to advise them on gymnastics. I think they were new to the sport, they'd won the rights, and I used to go behind the scenes and advise to which gymnast to include, did a little bit of commentary, etc. And I think the fact that I just got that little bit of experience, there was then an opportunity in a traineeship at the BBC. So I was able to use that, because so often in this industry, isn't it, it's chicken and egg. It's, do you have some experience that gets you through the door? So I'm very, very grateful for that little opportunity I had at ITV, because I think that helped me get the traineeship. So I remember going down to Broadcasting House and doing an interview, and 8 gentlemen sat around the table, and they sort of quizzed me for about half an hour. And I know I got some of the questions completely wrong, but nevertheless, I got a place, and that was fantastic. And that allowed me to work across a number of different departments. So it's like a sort of taster session. You do so many months. I did the natural history unit. I did regional news. I did news and current affairs. But I think I was always destined for sport. And I'm quite sure I got my place on that training scheme because of my sporting background.
Did you always want to work in broadcasting?
No, not at all. I don't think I was probably just one of those students that didn't know what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. The opportunity, though, to see and be involved in a production, though, absolutely whetted my appetite. I remember seeing a brilliant director in action, Paul Lang. I mean, he sadly passed away at a young age. I just thought, that's the best job in the world. Mm-hmm. Because there he was sitting in his sort of OB outside broadcast truck, you know, directing the cameras, and the event was unfolding. And I just thought this was a brilliant industry, mm-hmm. and one that I would really love to be part of. Mm-hmm. But that gave me the insight, the spark, because otherwise I don't know that I would have ever known. I'd have probably gone on to be a teacher.
Aha.
Well, my parents were.
What was it about that OB van kind of moment that so captivated you, do you think? I
think it was the buzz.
Right.
It was live. It was exciting. Everyone was pulling together to put a production on the air. It was exciting, mm-hmm. and I think that's what I really loved about it.
Did you ever aspire to continue the commentary career, or were you always pointed in the direction of the production, slightly more of the back of house stuff?
I possibly could have done, but I think that would have been maybe in the world of gymnastics. And actually, I loved what I saw as a job and a role and as an industry. So I didn't necessarily want to just be in the world of gymnastics. I mean, I'm a fan of so many different sports. And I think of the impact that sport can have. You know, people talk about the power of sport. I absolutely believe that. You know, it changed my life, and I believe it changes a lot of people's lives. So I think the idea that I could have a career in the world of sport was something that absolutely I wanted to do.
Tell us a little bit about the progression through the BBC then to
Yes.
where you ended up as director of sport. That was a lot of years, I presume, a lot of different roles, a lot of different events and productions involved in that. How did that time period play out?
Well, I probably wasn't a very good fit with some of the other departments. I remember spending time in the natural history unit, and there was a very, very big event, and it was bird watching from the Camargue. And I made the mistake of asking the executive producer, where was the Camargue?
Uh-oh.
I mean, if anybody could give you a look that made you shrivel up, that was the look I received. And I didn't quite have the courage, but what I really wanted to say to him was, well, because he said, where have you been all your life? Which was a bit of a put down.
Surely southwest France
Indeed,
is
not where I'd been.
Right.
And I just wanted to say to him, well, you know, I have actually done this, this and this and this, you know, been in Olympics, but I wasn't brave enough. But my future wasn't with the natural history unit.
Yeah.
But luckily, I got transferred and ended up in sport, which was wonderful.
Did the bird-watching cabal in the BBC kind of maintain its power base, or did they
I
grow?
don't know. I joined a whole new world, which was the sports department, which was, to be fair, very different from the natural history unit.
Yeah. So when did you move into the sports department proper, and what was your progression there?
So I did my various stints. I then joined sport as effectively a sort of trainee. And interestingly, I joined the department in Manchester. And of course, we've recently moved back to Manchester. But that was great. I remember working on snooker and bowls and all sorts of wonderful things, horse racing. And eventually, so I started my career in the Manchester Sport Department. And then there were opportunities in London. So I applied and came down at the old Kensington House. I think it's now a hotel in West London, but that's where we were based. And it was those early years were really invigorating. They were tough. They were tough. It was quite a hard school, and you couldn't afford to mess up. But I'd learned loads and loads and loads.
What did you learn during that period that then you took into the leadership role that you eventually
I think
took
really
up?
sound production skills. I mean, what is interesting is when I joined, there were no mobile phones. They were only prototypes. There was no Channel 4 or Channel 5. It was a very, very different world. Radio and television were entirely separate departments. So I came into the world of TV, and I remember early on spending time in a film cutting room, which was, it seems extraordinary now, 2-inch tape, do we remember those? Lugging those around the building, huge, great things. But nevertheless, you learned the foundations of production, and that's what I loved.
And this was the era of Grandstand and some of those huge brands that people were extremely attached to.
Yes, and that took, what was interesting, I think, in that era is there weren't multiple channels. So when Grandstand, you talk about Grandstand, that was because that was an outlet for many, many different sports. So in a way, they had to be edited, and there were skills required for that. I think what we've seen with the advent of pay TV with the streamers is that actually what audiences want is they want to watch the sport that they love. They don't necessarily want their football interrupted by the 3:30 from Haydock Park. That is an era gone. And I think that's one of the things I would say reflecting is from an incredibly restricted amount of choice, which was the technology and was the industry at the time. Now, it's absolutely amazing. Multiple sports channels and an ability, I think, for events to almost cover themselves, if there isn't necessarily a big broadcaster that wants to come along. So the choice for audiences, I just think is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Looking at your directorship in particular, I mean, do you think about the word legacy? And if you do, how would you define that?
What I want to be careful of is the foundations, if you like, for a legacy were laid before I came into my role. But I think what we have seen is this transition, as you say, into digital. And that has been amazing. And if I look back, I think it was maybe the Sydney Olympics where there was first dedicated sport pages. And I think that that has been one of the most amazing achievements, is to see our digital services, particularly BBC Sport online, and just what an essential part that is to kind of most sports fans' daily consumption of sport. You know, the numbers are fantastic, and it's almost invented new ways of covering sport. And if ever you've been out and about and you've not had access to a TV or a radio, following something on live text, it's a brilliant experience, and the numbers say that. And it's almost a new form of journalism, this sort of telling a story live, drawing in the best expert, maybe a line from commentary, maybe something from a fan or a comment, and pulling that all together with a tone of voice that's really from a fan, from somebody that clearly loves that sport. I think is fantastic.
When you stepped into that top job, the directorship, what did you inherit there? Obviously, you knew what you were getting into because you'd been in the department for a while. What did you inherit? What was ahead of you then? And then looking ahead to now, your successor has just been announced. What does he inherit from you?
Well, I think, and it is fair to say this, the BBC and BBC Sport has an ability to amplify and bring reach to events. And we've just seen that over and over again. And you only have to look at the 2012 Olympics. It set records. So people talk about the demise of terrestrial television. In a way, I think that's slightly confused, because it may be that the means by which people watch might change. So it might be via the iPlayer as opposed to BBC One. But the Olympics is the Olympics, and that is available both on the iPlayer and via terrestrial TV. So what I think I certainly have seen and benefited and would love to feel, have genuinely seen continue, is the ability of the BBC and BBC Sport to bring people together in a way, at a scale that I think it is very difficult for others to do. That role of national broadcasting, national broadcaster, I think we see, we talk about the national conversation. So often sport is at the heart of that. And I think that the BBC has a genuine and unique ability to amplify, to bring those events in a way to people. I remember in a World Cup, you're maybe on a underground or a bus or what have you, and everybody's got their phones out, and I can actually see the yellow and black. I'm trying to sort of have a peek at what people are looking at, and it's I think it's just wonderful the way sport can unify, and everybody can have a conversation and opinion about sport. It's a sort of safe space, isn't it, for people to, just opinion and debate and discuss.
I'll take any opportunity, as I would imagine you will, to talk about the London 2012 Olympics. Does that go down as both one of your most memorable and most challenging moments? Yes. And what I would really want to emphasise here is how much of a team effort that is. And I just remember, let's be honest, TV, sometimes there are egos in television. None. It just wasn't like that. There was a real collective sense of responsibility that we must not let the side down. This was a unique and precious moment that the UK was hosting an Olympic Games. We had to make sure that we really delivered, amplified that. It was the first time that you could watch whatever event you wanted to watch. I think we pulled together an extraordinary team of talent on air, and that guided audiences through, and that was both experience in terms of the presenter's chair, but right the way through into commentary and pundits, etc. It was a celebration of sport, and I think anybody involved in that should feel rightly proud. But my takeaway was the mission was clear. And it's interesting, people talk about leadership and direction and etc. Because it was so clear what we had to do, everybody rallied behind. And I think it's probably the best team spirit that I've ever experienced. Thinking about other memorable moments during this period, I guess you touched on it. The move to Salford was obviously something that created a lot of headlines, created a lot of noise. How do you reflect on that in terms of the build-up to that move, and actually what's happened since then? Because it's a good number of years since BBC Sport has moved up there, and it's seems from the outside to have become very established as part
Indeed.
of what is a new media hub in that part of the world.
It is, and I think it's been a catalyst for a lot of growth and a lot of industries working in that area as well. So I really think that it has delivered. I think the Northwest has got an extraordinary, record, if you like, in the world of sport. You've only got to look in football. I think it was a really fitting location. I think what was also good, and this also applied to children's, is we're slightly different. Children's is self-commissioning. It's got its own children's networks. Sport is much more of a rights-based model, less of a commissioned model. And that, I think, gives a degree of robustness. And, what you don't want is just to be a satellite. And I think it was a very, very clever construct of the different departments that went. 5 Live was another. It's really provided a different tone of voice that I think is added enormously into that sort of audio space, and I think it's been extremely successful. But I think that ability to start from scratch with technology that paved the way, HD, digital, tapeless, I mean, that now sounds just old-fashioned, doesn't it? But actually at the time it was really, really important, and it enabled us to take, I think, a really big leap forward. I think the other area it really benefited was from our journalism and our sports news, in that we were higgledy-piggledy around television centre, lift here, a corridor there. It has sort of organically grown in different places, which didn't work well in terms of if you were trying to integrate the department. But to be able to co-site and have people working alongside each other in that start-to-scratch environment. And I think sport also contributed a lot to Salford and to Media City and the BBC's presence there. You walk across the plaza and there is a live production going on through those windows. And that's on the 15 minutes. That's either domestically or globally. That creates an incredible buzz on site. And I think that's been a really important contribution to how that... It's vibrant and it has, I think, a unique kind of quality that I don't think you could probably build it having a legacy building.
Barbara, this idea of doing more for less, it's the blight of the BBC, I guess, and something that you've had to think about throughout your time there, and no doubt the BBC will have to continue to think about. But it's gone alongside this sort of wider developments in the sports broadcasting space, experimentation with production, experimentation with content. Where do you see all of this going?
I mean, I think it's important we exploit every opportunity. I mean, in a way, we want people to enjoy sport. We want people to be able to access sport. And a linear schedule is a very difficult thing as competition. ITV1, BBC One. There are many, many different genres to serve. So it's going to be limited, the amount of time that can be given to sport. So you can stream sport, you can push sport out onto social media. And I think that is just increasing the amount of choice. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose I'm a bit of a believer in long-form sport, in that if you're really going to take something from an event, you can't do that in 30 seconds. So I know that there's a lot of conversation about attention and that getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And by the way, I think better that somebody watches 30 seconds than nothing at all. But I think if at all possible, to be able to offer people that slightly greater depth and longer form coverage, I think there's a real kind of value in that. But maybe that's a personal view, maybe that's an old-fashioned view. But to me, I think the aim is to use those outlets, but to draw people in to then enjoy the event in its full richness, if you like. So I think there will be many, many ways of distributing content in the future. And I think it's up to broadcasters to exploit that. I think the other big thing that we've seen is with improvements in technology is almost everybody can be a broadcaster. They can use your mobile phone, and it's extraordinary now, if you like, how I think the new generations coming through are so media savvy. You've only got to look on Instagram and you'll see some extraordinary editing and creative capability, pulling stories together, etc. And that is much more universal than it ever used to be. And I think taking that to another level, what you are able to see is sports to self-help. So one of the things that we do is, as you talked about, we're trying to do, if we still want to offer the breadth and range of coverage that we do, it simply isn't possible for the BBC to turn up with the big OB trucks to maybe some sports that are more of niche interest. So what we will do is we will work in a partnership with the governing body, and we will say, if you provide a feed that's of a certain quality, that complies with our sort of commercial and editorial guidelines, there is a platform which can broadcast. And particularly, we've made a commitment to UK Sport to say, if UK Sport is putting funding into an event and there isn't a broadcaster outlet for it, then the BBC will make its streaming services available. And amongst some demographics now, more people are accessing content by iPlayer digitally than they are through the traditional linear networks. So it's about exploiting everything. I think one of the big challenges now, and this is both for broadcasters and for sport, is navigation and discoverability. Because it's all very well, you might be able to make access of your or coverage of your sport available, but if nobody knows where it is, then that's a real struggle. So I think as that world becomes more sophisticated, and we're seeing it already, you probably notice it. I hope you're both iPlayer users, but if you watch something, you will get served up content that is being measured. And that is to make sure that the sort of the rich offering that the BBC has is made available to you, because there are probably things the BBC is doing that you would love to watch or engage with or listen to that you might not know about. So I think it is the job of broadcasters to try and make that discoverability and that navigation easier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an iPlayer user. Are you an iPlayer user?
I'm mainly a BBC Sounds guy, actually.
Well, that's a radio version.
It's a radio version,
version.
I match the radio to the pictures on the TV.
Yeah, an amazing service.
Yeah.
You've obviously been a great champion of free-to-air coverage of sport. And I just wonder how you have made that argument, and talking about the development of women's sport, what you see that argument being for women's sport in particular into the future.
I think it's an argument. I don't think it does just apply to women's sport. I think it applies to all sport. And I think it is really important that there is access. And I think the sport industry as a whole needs that. We're seeing more and more fragmentation. It isn't, unless I think you're incredibly wealthy, possible necessarily for you to subscribe to all of the things that you would need to subscribe to get a big cross-section of sport. There is a place for free-to-air sport, just as there is a place for people to have choice and to pay for greater depth and events that they want. And I think there are some events that lend themselves in particular to free-to-air. I think the big international events, the World Cups, that you just think of how special those few weeks are in the UK. And if that wasn't available to everybody, how different those events would be. Of course, some of the governing bodies recognise that, and they actually build in, the IOC, for example, builds into its charter a degree of free-to-air access. So I don't think it's only broadcasters or free-to-air broadcasters, public service broadcasters, that are fans of free-to-air sport. I think some of the governing bodies. And interestingly, I suspect, I can't speak on their behalf, but paid broadcasters too want their sport in the public eye. They want the interest. They want it. That's ultimately where a subscriber base is going to come from. So I do think there is possible to have a balance in the industry, and we have a listed event regime. I think that listed event regime is absolutely critical. I think there is good support for that regime. I think it needs to be modernised. At the moment, there isn't provision for on-demand, which, given the way people consume now, given the fact that you might have events over in different time zones, I think a degree of on-demand, which is exactly the same principle. You don't want to divide so that those that access their content digitally are excluded, but those maybe that are watching more traditional means do have access. I think the principle of listed events is availability, and it's therefore important to recognise the very different construct that we have now in the media industry. But I am an absolute champion of that. But I think what is interesting is we are seeing some rights being constructed with a mix in mind. So effectively the bundling of rights to create some access for free-to-air. When the ECB launched the 100, it was a constructed to provide some outlets for free to air. We made a commitment to do a live match effectively once a week, and one of the semi-finals and the final, and you know, I believe made a really significant contribution in the impact that that event had when it first landed. And I don't believe that impact would have been the same if it had just been behind a paywall.
There's the BBC's role in sport, and then there's sport's role within the BBC and its wider offering, as you touched on earlier. As you leave your role, what do you think is sport's role within the BBC?
Sport is incredibly valued, and we see the evidence of that over and over again as constraints get tighter. I mean, let's just put some of this in perspective. So over the last decade, sports rights have doubled, and the BBC's income has gone down 30%. And yet, and there have been some losses, actually it's an incredibly strong portfolio. And it would be incredibly easy for the BBC to say, gosh, look at some of those sports rights fees, look where we might be able to invest that. But there is a recognition of the value of sport and the importance of sport to audiences. Sport has an ability to reach often underserved audiences, and you know, it's absolutely essential that the BBC is trying to provide something for everybody and for all audiences, and sport is a brilliant way of doing that. And these are, you know, we touched on it about these national events. It's the national broadcaster. You want to bring those, and I think it's one to the benefit of the BBC, but I think it's the benefit of those events as well because of the audiences that the BBC can bring, and we've seen that repeated over and over again. What I would call kind of breakthrough events that suddenly are elevated. And if you like, reach not just beyond the core sport fan, but reach beyond that. And I think it's very important we have those moments.
Sport, as you've mentioned, is a rights model within the BBC, within all sports broadcasters. Director of sport, it's your responsibility to manage and maintain that portfolio of sports rights. The BBC is obviously in a unique position in terms of its funding, in terms of its mission, in terms of all these different aspects. That being the case, how would you go into a sports rights negotiation?
I think being really clear on what the BBC can offer. And reach is a part of it. But I do think the amplification is really important as well, because we're very, very fortunate in that there's quite a bit in the armoury. You know, yes, there's BBC One, which is brilliant. You know, it's still the most, you know, popular network. But actually what we can do digitally to sort of surround sound that, so that if you know, on a Wimbledon morning, you know, if you wake up, it's there on the website, all of the news, all of the preview, what you might look forward to. You're driving to work, you've got 5 Live talking about it, building up to the day. You've, you know, in your lunch break, you know, you can perhaps watch on TV, or maybe you've got your streaming device, your iPad there tucked under your computer, or maybe it's on your computer. And just that ability to use and amplify an event using all of those platforms to build, and I think we see it again with the cricket, where you've got this fantastic combination of absolutely brilliant TMS, you know, just such an iconic, wonderful you know, program, and we then have the you know, the digital clips of the action. Can cross-promote each other. You can have an incredibly rich experience. You know, cricket's quite long form. It's quite difficult for somebody maybe to spend all day watching cricket, but actually by using those multiple platforms, you know, you can keep in touch. You can have all of the relevant moments, and I think it's a model that you know, I think works, you know, incredibly well. You know, you just got to look at the Ashes and the impact of the Ashes, and although we might not be the long form live broadcaster, I think the BBC brought an incredible amount to the amplification and people's enjoyment of that event. We provided an access that if you didn't have a subscription, you could still enjoy.
Barbara, I remember bumping into you once at Sportel, the sports rights meeting place. And it wasn't just you, it was you and a number of, I think, other broadcast representatives. and Barry Hearn was there, sort of
Yes.
holding forth. I think some sort of informal poker game had been set up. Barry's obviously a fabulous character and has been involved in multiple sports, and multiple sports have been broadcast on the BBC in the past. You must have come across all sorts of characters like that in your time. Who would you
I
point
would
to?
actually say Barry, I think, is incredibly special.
Yeah.
Because he, I think, recognised the value of the BBC, of the reach that we can provide. And interestingly, I think he's taken a similar view with Sheffield, where he's done long-term deals, and he's done long-term deals with us. And there's a fair bit of banter goes on, because I put my best, we haven't got any money hat on, and Barry, oh, not this again. And we, there's a bit of toing and froing, but so far we've always been able to meet in the middle, and I've just loved working with somebody who's just no nonsense and straight dealing.
Yeah.
You just, and there is I'd like to feel a mutual respect that is essential to a negotiation.
Yeah.
Because if you feel the other side is holding something back, does that mean you push a bit further? And often a negotiation is a compromise. And I think that, if you feel both sides are making a compromise, then that is a good way through. I mean, probably the best negotiation is when both sides feel a bit, did I do the best deal? But it's got to be both sides feel that.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked quite a lot about the external part of the role, negotiating, working with the industry, with rights holders. I just wonder from a team management point of view, if you like, there's obviously a lot of qualities that a leader needs to bring to the people that they work with, whether it's motivating, whether it's challenging. And as we've talked about, the rights market, there are ebbs and flows, there are wins and losses. How do you reflect on the way that you were able to perhaps not let the highs be too high and not let the lows be too low during a period in which you were in charge of what is quite a volatile industry in some respects? Well,
I would say it's all about team. And I think leadership has changed over time. If I think of when I first joined, often it was a much more dictatorial. It was, a leader deciding. And actually, it's now much more about collaboration and about working as a team. So those highs and lows are shared. And I think that that's really, really important. And if I had any advice for anybody, it was appoint great people. Make sure you've got a great team, and make sure you empower that team as well. And I would say that's been one of the great joys of the job, is the brilliant people that I've worked with, and what they do, and the way their expertise, if you like, shines. Because if your team is firing on all cylinders, that's going to make you successful. So I think that would be the one thing that I would say is, don't be afraid to discuss, to share, to take multiple opinions, and that will help you shape good decisions that are seen from all sides. Because it's very easy to think, if I make this decision, but actually what are the unintended consequences? Think that through, what might happen. So I would say team spirit, collaboration, listening to what your experts say, and gather all of that best information before you make your decisions.
Final question, this one, Barbara, and presumably the way that you got into broadcasting wouldn't happen these days. A young gymnast put in front of a panel of 8 men grilling you on this, that and the other. What would your advice be now for people wanting to break into sports broadcasting, people wanting to kind of follow in your footsteps?
I would say be media savvy. Live and breathe it. Watch it. I mean, I've done interviews where I've said to somebody, do you what do you like about BBC Sport, or is there a programme that you think? And I've been amazed that people haven't been able to answer. And I think, but if this is something you need to live and breathe, and you need to really kind of love it, watch it, be a part of it. Actually, I think you can get to a level, as I say, in terms of media savvy, use social media, edit on social media, be an active, participant in it. Because I think that means that if you do get the opportunity to come through the door, you've got some, you've got opinions, you've got some knowledge, that can be shaped rather than I want to work in sports broadcasting. I think you've got to think what as an individual can you bring, and make sure you shout loud about that, but actually invest in that as well.
What's the bit you'll miss the most?
Oh, the brilliant colleagues, no question about it. It's been fun. And as I say, you talked about ups and downs and shared highs. It's been wonderful to share some real highs with some brilliant colleagues. And that's not just in the senior team. I would look back, when I was in the director's chair as an OB director, when there's a camera crew and you're all pulling in the same direction. That is just a wonderful experience, a kind of shared endeavour.
Barbara Slater, thank you very much indeed.